On a hill at the head of Main Street in Towsenton, New Hampshire, just a few doors up from the public library, stands the old Turnbuckle place. Mrs. Turnbuckle was the children's librarian at that library for 60 years before she died. And she had no children, so she left the house to the town, at which point it stood vacant and began to fall into disrepair. It had been one of those handsome old Victorians. It was a lovely shade of blue with fish scale shingles and a two-tone slate roof, an octagonal turret, all surrounded by Mrs. Turnbuckle's prize-winning flower gardens. But by the time of our story, the paint was peeling, the shutters were hanging at odd angles, some of the windows were broken, the hedges were overgrown and unkempt, the trees were even standing stark and troubled. So it didn't take much for people to start to say, "Stay away from the old Turnbuckle place. It's haunted." Then, of course, it became a rite of passage for local teenagers to try to spend the night alone in the old house. I say try because, to my knowledge, none of them succeeded past midnight before they were running down the hill, blubbering and dragging their sleeping bags behind them. The hero of our story, young Nicole Hardscrabble, lived a mile out Cold Pond Road from the center of town in a little ranch house with her father and mother. Her dad, Bob, had been a well-respected local carpenter, but after the economic downturn, he spent most of his time during the day puttering around the house, waiting for the phone to ring, drinking O'Doul's, and half watching ESPN on TV. Nicole's mother, Marge, held down 3 jobs to keep the family economy afloat, so she was hardly ever at home. One evening, Nicole and her dad were eating their hot dogs and beans in front of the evening news on television. And there was a story about how rising gas prices and record oil company profits are good for the economy. Then there was a story about local delinquents getting arrested for stripping the copper out of vacant buildings. And then there was a piece about local developer Mycroft Skinner, who was offering the town a public-private partnership. And there was a clip of him making a presentation before the Board of Selectmen. "Ladies and gentlemen, the project I'm proposing will be the key to the revitalization of downtown Towsenton. My Connecticut-based client, Loud Fun Incorporated, previously known for their work in gentlemen's racetrack design, is now a pioneer in the civilian aerospace field. Together we propose to tear down the blighted eyesore known as the Turnbuckle House, scrape the site clean, and replace it with a 22nd century recreation park devoted to affordable space travel. In the short term, it will provide hundreds of skilled and unskilled construction jobs. In the medium and long term, there will be dozens of well-paid customer service positions, but most importantly, this will provide a permanent economic boost by making Towsenton a hub for extraterrestrial adventure." Well, Nicole was a little excited by this sales pitch. She said, "Hundreds of construction jobs, Daddy. A permanent economic boost." But her father shook his head and said, "Honey, the only ones getting a permanent economic boost out of this will be Mycroft Skinner and Loud Fun Incorporated. Our town stands to gain nothing by becoming a playground for out-of-town gazillionaires. When Nicole's friends had first dared her to spend the night in the haunted house, her first thought was she didn't have time. She had all that homework to do and her babysitting jobs, and any time she had left over had to be devoted to figuring out how the heck she was going to afford college now that a 4-year college education cost as much as a modest family home used to. But on further reflection, she realized that a night at the old place would give her time to focus on those thorny trigonometry problems she'd been wrestling with. And maybe she'd have a little time left over for some uninterrupted thinking. Besides, she wasn't scared by the old place, even though Mrs. Turnbuckle had died when she was very young. Some of her earliest memories revolved around that library. In fact, she had taken her first steps walking over to a shelf to pull down a book to have her mother read to her. And she and her mother had been devotees of Mrs. Turnbuckle's story hours. So late one night, after her father had fallen asleep in front of the TV while her mother was still down at the diner closing up, she dropped her trig textbook and her 3-wing binder and a flashlight and a couple of snacks into her Towsenton Public Library tote bag. She went out the door and down Cold Pond Road to the center of town, where the street lamps guided her steps to the wrought iron gate of the Turnbuckle place. And on the other side of the gate, the moon lit her steps up to the porch, where she found a couple of loose boards on one of the broken windows, and she pulled them aside and gingerly stepped in, and bats fluttered down to greet her and mice skittered away from her feet, but she was undeterred. She took out her flashlight and panned around the hallway. And the first thing she saw was a life-size portrait of Mrs. Turnbuckle smiling down at her, and she smiled back. And then she felt a cool breeze and the hair went up on the back of her neck. And coming down the stairs in front of her, she saw the diaphanous image of Mrs. Turnbuckle herself, with one hand raised high in the air as if holding a torch. She glided down towards her and then saw her and said, "Why, if it isn't Nicole Hardscrabble! I didn't hear you come in. How are you, dear? So nice to see you." "Nice to see you too, Mrs. Turnbuckle. But why are you holding your hand in the air like that?" "Oh, my dear, when I had my coronary and died, I was in the middle of reshelving my favorite old copy of Little Women. Now I'm doomed to float about in the high reshelving position until that book is returned to its proper place on the shelves." Well, Nicole knew a little bit about ghosts. She said, "Really, Mrs. Turnbuckle? Is that all that's holding you here? Why are you haunting your house?" "Well, my dear, as you may know, I perished without any living heirs. So the fortune I had earned through wise investment of my librarian's salary I left to the town so that the addition so long needed by the library could be constructed. I had lost faith in this house of cards of an economic system, and I had turned all my money into gold bars and buried them in the cellar. All these years that these children have been trying to stay the night in my house, I've tried to tell them where the gold is buried so that they could deliver it to the library trustees, but they all see me and run away before I can tell them. Please don't think me a complainer, dear, but the afterlife has been very lonely. And now, with this unpleasant Mr. Skinner threatening to tear down my house and bring loud fun a few doors away from the library, I cannot rest until Mr. Skinner is stopped, my house is saved, and the library addition is built. Then Mrs. Turnbuckle led Nicole down into the ancient cellar and showed her the corner where the gold bars were buried. And the following morning, Nicole returned. First, she went to the library and made sure that copy of Little Women was in its proper place on the shelf. Then she brought a wheelbarrow to the Turnbuckle house, and she dug up those gold bars and delivered them to the chair of the Board of Library Trustees. And in due time, the library addition was built by a cooperative of local carpenters coordinated by Bob Hardscrabble. And that stimulated a rebirth of community spirit in Towsenton. And the community devoted themselves to all sorts of broadening activities at low decibel levels. Mycroft Skinner and Loud Fun Incorporated left the town in disgust and went off to find another town to bring into their version of the 22nd century. Every year, the biggest fundraiser of the Friends of the Towsenton Library is the Halloween haunted house that they hold at the old Turnbuckle place. And the highlight of every event is when the ghost of the old librarian floats down the stairs in the high reshelving position. People always marvel at how like the old librarian the ghost looks, and they wonder how it's done. And with another portion of Mrs. Turnbuckle's legacy, the Board of Trustees and the Friends of the Library established the Persephone A. Turnbuckle Memorial Scholarship to be awarded each year to a promising local youth to cover all the costs of a 4-year education. And the first year it was awarded to, wait for it, Nicole Hardscrabble. And she went off to UNH to study library science. It's hard to know what will end up becoming of that girl with all her prodigious capabilities, but it's not hard to see that whatever it is, she'll owe it all to at least one librarian and her local public library.